call came in at 6:47 on a Tuesday morning, and Yara Sims was already on her third cup of bad hospital coffee when she heard the code overhead. She didn't move right away. That was the thing nobody ever understood about her, the stillness before the action. People who didn't know her read it as hesitation. The orderlies had been reading it wrong for 8 months. The nurses on the day shift had been reading it wrong since October. And Dr. Whitman, who had a corner office on the 4th floor and a medical school diploma from Johns Hopkins framed in dark walnut, had been reading it wrong since the moment she walked through the service entrance on her first day with a mop cart and a visitor badge that said environmental scriphosis. She set her coffee cup on the edge of the supply cart, listened. The overhead page crackled again. Trauma Bay 2, multi-vehicle accident inbound. ETA 4 minutes, critical patient, possible internal bleed. Yara stood up slowly. Her back ached. It always ached now, ever since Kandahar. And she pressed one fist into the knot above her left hip, the way she'd learned to do in the dark of a forward operating base when there was no one around to see her grimace. Then she picked up the mop, turned the cart around, and started down the hall. She was not walking toward Trauma Bay 2. She was walking away from it, same as she'd been walking away from things like that for going on 2 years. She had a contract with herself. A deal she'd made sitting in a parking lot outside a VA clinic in Tucson, staring at a steering wheel for 40 minutes before she could make herself go inside. The deal was simple. She would not do that anymore. She would not be a medic anymore. She would push carts and clean floors and let other people carry the weight of keeping bodies alive. Because she had carried that weight long enough and it had cracked something in her that the VA counselor said might take years to heal. So she turned the cart around, and she heard the screaming, not the overhead page, not the clinical clipped radio chatter of paramedics. Actual screaming, a child's voice, high and sudden, from somewhere near the ambulance bay. And before Yara had finished processing what she was hearing, her body had already changed direction. Her hands knew things her mind had been trying to forget. The ER at St. Catherine's Regional in Baxter Falls, Colorado, was not, by any honest measure, a trauma center. It was a level 3 facility in a mid-sized mountain town that handled ski injuries, the occasional cardiac event, and whatever the interstate brought in during winter storms. What it was not equipped to handle, what it had no business handling, according to 3 separate departmental memos that Nursing Director Holt had submitted to administration and which administration had filed away without response, was a 5-car pileup on Highway 24 with a jackknifed semi involved. But here it was. The first ambulance was already backed into the bay when Yara rounded the corner. The paramedics, 2 of them, a woman named Torres, and a guy whose name she'd never learned, were moving fast, calling out numbers she recognized without meaning to recognize them. BP, GCS, respiratory rate. The language of triage lived in her body the way Spanish lived in people who learned it young. She couldn't unhear it. The screaming was coming from a girl, maybe 9 or 10, sitting on the curb with a gash across her forearm that was bleeding freely, but not arterially. A woman Yara assumed was her mother was kneeling beside her, pressing a fast food napkin to the wound and crying harder than the child. That was manageable. Yara crouched beside them. Hey, look at me. She kept her voice level, the way she'd kept it level in a dozen worse situations, and the girl looked up. What's your name? Poppy. Good. I'm Yara. Can I see your arm for a second? The mother started to say something. Something about a doctor, about waiting, and Yara was already gently peeling the napkin back. The laceration was maybe 4 centimeters, full thickness, clean edges. It needed sutures, and it needed pressure, and it was not going to kill anyone today. "Hold this here," she told the mother, repositioning her hand with firm, deliberate pressure. "Don't let go. I'm going to get someone." She stood up. That was when Dr. Whitman came through the ambulance bay doors. He was 43 years old, and he had the particular bearing of a man who had been told. He was exceptional so many times that he'd stopped questioning it. He wore his white coat the way some men wore a uniform, like it conferred something beyond just warmth. He looked at the girl on the curb, then at the paramedics working the gurney, then at Yara, who was still holding the bloody napkin she'd taken off Poppy's arm. "What are you doing out here?" he said, not to the paramedics, to her. Yara looked at him. "The girl has a lack on her forearm. She needs pressure and sutures." "I can see that," Whitman said, in the tone of a man who was demonstrating patience with someone who did not deserve it. "I'm asking what you are doing out here." "I came around to check on your environmental services." He said it the way someone might say you're a filing cabinet. Informational. Final. "Get back inside. We have clinical staff for this." Yara looked at the girl. Poppy was watching the exchange with wide eyes, the kind of watching that children do when they are cataloging adult behavior for future reference. "The mother needs to maintain that pressure or inside," Whitman said. "Please." She went inside. She pushed the cart back down the corridor toward the supply room, and she did not look back, and she told herself that what she felt was relief. The relief of someone else's problem being someone else's problem. She had enough of her own. She got as far as the linen closet before the radio chatter changed. She wasn't supposed to be on the hospital frequency. She wasn't supposed to have a radio at all, technically. But 8 months of working overnight shifts meant she'd figured out the channel. Because the alternative was not knowing when a hazmat situation or a code gray was happening in your section. And she was not interested in being caught off guard. She kept the volume low. She kept it to herself. What she heard now was Torres calling for backup. 2nd ambulance incoming. 3rd was right behind it. Multiple criticals. The trauma bay was already full. There were not enough hands. Yara closed her eyes. She stood there in the hallway outside the linen closet for 11 seconds. She counted. The way she'd learned to count in forward operating bases when she needed to slow her own heart rate. And then she picked up the radio and walked back toward the trauma bay. The 2nd ambulance brought a man named Beaumont, according to the ID in his wallet that Torres read off while they were still moving. 51 years old, had been driving a pickup truck that had gone under the semi's trailer. The paramedics had intubated him in the field, which meant his airway was the least of anyone's current problems. The problem was his abdomen, which was rigid, which meant internal bleeding, which meant he needed a surgeon and an oar, and neither of those things was going to materialize in the next 4 minutes. Dr. Whitman was running the room. There were 2 nurses, Satterley and a float named Brenda, whose last name Yara had never caught, and a respiratory therapist and a medical student who looked like he was doing everything in his power not to faint. The charge nurse, Okonkwo, was at the desk running interference on incoming calls. It was not enough people. It was not close to enough people. Yara stood in the doorway. She had put on gloves. She didn't know when she'd done it. Somewhere between the linen closet and here, muscle memory had simply handled it. She was wearing blue nitrile gloves, and she was standing in the doorway of a trauma bay watching a man's blood pressure crash on the monitor, and she could feel the old familiar thing waking up in her chest, the thing she'd spent 2 years trying to put back to sleep. "His pressure's dropping," Satterley called out. "I see it," Whitman said. 80/50. I see it, Satterley. "We don't have blood products up here, Dr. Whitman. Blood bank is pulling O-neg, but it's going to be. I know what we have." He adjusted the IV line. "Get me another large bore, antecubital if you can." The medical student moved toward the patient's right arm and fumbled with the IV kit. His hands were shaking. Yara watched him miss the vein and heard the small, suppressed sound Satterley made. Not contempt, just the exhausted acknowledgement of one more thing going wrong. And she was through the doorway before she'd made any conscious decision to move. "Let me," she said, and took the kit from the student's hands. She found the vein on the first try. It wasn't difficult. It was just a matter of knowing where to look and not letting your hands get ahead of your eyes. She had done this in worse light than this. She had done this in moving vehicles and in buildings that were not entirely intact, and once, memorably, in total darkness. The silence in the room lasted about 3 seconds. Who authorized? Whitman started. "Pressure's still dropping," Satterley said. 72/40. She's not. There are protocols. "Tension pneumo," Yara said. She wasn't looking at Whitman. She was looking at the patient's chest, at the way it moved, at the asymmetry that had been there since they'd wheeled him in, and that nobody had called because everyone had been focused on the abdomen. His left side. "Listen." Whitman stared at her. "Dr. Whitman." She kept her voice even. "Decreased breath sounds, left side, trachea deviation. His pressure's not dropping because of the belly. It's dropping because his lung is collapsing. Your environmental services," he said, and there was something in his voice now that she recognized, not arrogance exactly, but the specific, terrible blankness of a man who had decided that the category a person existed was more reliable information than anything that person might be saying. She had met it before. She had met it on her second deployment, from a captain who had looked at her and seen a 26-year-old woman instead of a special operations combat medic with 140 field hours logged in the worst possible conditions. She had met it, and she had learned to go around it. "Then needle his chest yourself," she said. "Left side, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. But do it in the next 90 seconds or you're going to lose him." She stepped back, gave him the room. He didn't move for 2 full seconds. She watched him, watched the war happening behind his eyes. The calculation of what it would mean to take instruction from someone whose badge said environmental services. And then the monitor screamed and the moment ended, and Whitman moved. He did it right. She gave him that. His hands were steady, and he found the landmark. And he decompressed the chest, the way it needed to be decompressed. And when the rush of air came, it was like something loosening in the whole room. The blood pressure started climbing, 64, 71, 78. "Get surgery on the phone," Whitman said to Okonkwo. His voice had changed. It was quieter. "Tell them we need an oar." Yara was already moving. The third ambulance brought 2 more patients, a teenage boy with a fractured femur and a woman in her 60s who had been a passenger in the truck and had taken the door impact directly to her thorax. The teenager was in pain but stable. The woman was not stable. Her name, according to the information Torres relayed, was Esperanza Mendel. She was 64 years old, and she had broken ribs, and she had the particular look of someone whose body was marshaling all its remaining resources to keep the essential functions running and did not have a great deal in reserve. Whitman was still with Beaumont. Satterley was stretched between two patients. The float nurse, Brenda, was managing the teenager, which she could handle, which left Esperanza Mendel in the second bay with the medical student and not enough else. Yara looked at the student. He was doing better than before. The fumbled IV had settled something in him, the way failing at something often does. But he was still working from a place of managed panic, which was not nothing but was not enough. "What's your name?" she asked him. He blinked. "Fam. 3rd year." "Okay, Fam. Tell me her breath sounds." He listened, he told her. They were diminished bilaterally but worse on the right, which confirmed what she'd suspected from the way Mendel was holding her body, the micro-posturing of someone whose right side hurt to inflate. "Watch her OSAT," Yara told him. "If it drops below 90, you call me immediately. Don't wait. Don't second guess. He started, and then he stopped, apparently deciding that whatever he'd been about to say was not the most useful thing he could be doing. "Okay. Yeah, she's also going to need pain management before anyone moves her, or she's going to fight ya. Remind whoever's covering to get that order in early." He was writing on his palm. She had seen this before. Young students who ran out of surfaces and started writing on themselves. It always made her think of soldiers doing the same thing, writing grid coordinates on their forearms in the dark. The impulse to put critical information somewhere on your body where you couldn't lose it. She left him with the patient and went to find Satterley. It took 40 minutes for the immediate crisis to stabilize enough that the room stopped feeling like it was operating above its structural load limit. Beaumont was in the elevator, heading to the ORR. Mendel was being monitored, pain managed, waiting on radiology. The teenager had been given something for the femur and was currently asking Brenda whether the Wi-Fi reached to his bay. Yara was in the medication room, removing her gloves, when Whitman came in. She heard him before she saw him, the specific cadence of his footsteps, which she had learned over 8 months the same way she had learned every other environmental variable in this building, because paying attention to environment was something she had been doing since long before she'd ever set foot in a hospital hallway. She finished pulling off the second glove, folded them inside out the way she'd been taught, dropped them in the waste bin. "Who are you?" he said. It came out as a statement, not a question. She turned around. He was standing in the doorway, and the particular energy of the earlier confrontation was gone. What was left in its place was harder to read. She had seen men look like this before. The look of someone recalibrating, someone discovering that the map they'd been using bore no relationship to the actual terrain. "Yara Sims," she said. "Environmental Services. I started last October. That's not what I'm asking." She looked at him for a moment. Outside, she could hear the unit settling, the ambient sounds of a trauma bay returning to its baseline, the specific frequencies of monitors and footsteps and people's voices dropping out of crisis register. "I was a special operations combat medic," she said. 4 deployments. 2nd and 3rd were Afghanistan. I did my last tour as a senior medic with a Special Forces ODE out of Fort Bragg. She paused. "I separated from service 2 years ago." Whitman was quiet. "You called attention pneumothorax," he said finally. "Yes, from the doorway. I've seen a lot of them." He looked at her for a long moment, not the earlier look, the categorical dismissal, but something that had more effort in it, something that was working harder. "Why are you pushing a mop cart?" he said. She picked up the empty glove wrapper from the counter and put it in the waste bin. straightened the small collection of supplies she'd disturbed when she'd been looking for gloves earlier. Ordinary things, she did them deliberately. "I needed a break," she said. It was the closest to the truth she was willing to go, with a man she'd known for 8 months without him once learning her name. The debrief happened in the hallway, not in any official room, and it wasn't exactly a debrief. It was Okonkwo stopping her near the service elevator and saying, in a low voice, "You saved that man's life," with the direct factual certainty of someone who did not traffic in sentimentality. Yara said, "The team saved his life. The team was about to miss a tension pneumo. They would have caught it." "Maybe," Okonkwo said, and then, studying her with the calm attention of a woman who had been a charge nurse for 16 years and had therefore developed an unusually accurate sense of when someone was telling her the truth. "Maybe not." Yara pressed the button for the service elevator. "Are you going to tell anyone?" Okonkwo asked. "Tell anyone what?" "About your background." The elevator arrived. The doors opened. "You already know," Yara said. "Who else do you need to tell?" She got in. The doors closed. What she hadn't told Whitman, what she hadn't told Okonkwo, what she hadn't told anyone at St. Catherine's Regional, or in Baxter Falls, or in any of the 3 other places she had lived since separating from service, was the specifics of why she had needed the break, not the general answer. The PTSD, the burnout, the specific psychic exhaustions of being a person who holds other people together while something in yourself is quietly coming apart. That part she had told the VA counselor and the 2 therapists she'd seen since, and she had gotten reasonably comfortable saying those words in the order they needed to be said. The specifics were different. The last call she had run as a special operations combat medic had been in a village whose name she was not going to say because the name was attached to too many other things she was not ready to look at directly. A teammate had been wounded, shrapnel, right thigh, femoral involvement, the kind of injury that announced its seriousness immediately and gave you a narrow window. She had worked that injury in the back of a vehicle, moving at speed over a road that was not a road, with inadequate light and 2 other people talking at her simultaneously through comms, and she had kept Trevino. She could say his name. She had never stopped being able to say his name. She had kept Trevino alive until they reached the surgical team at the forward surgical unit, at which point the surgeon had taken over and Trevino had lived. The way that story ended was not the problem with it. The problem with it was the 47 minutes in between, and what her nervous system had decided to do with the memory of those 47 minutes, which was to replay them on a loop at no particular schedule for the following 19 months. Not always the full 47. Sometimes just a piece, the sound the vehicle made on that road, or the smell of the tourniquet material, or the specific angle of available light, fragments, arriving at random, leaving her standing in a supply room or a parking lot, or, once memorably, in the cereal aisle of a grocery store in Tucson, waiting for the fragment to finish playing before she could move again. She had not run a trauma code since that night. She had told herself she was never going to run one again. She had been wrong about that which was not the worst thing she'd ever been wrong about, but it was one of the more recent. 2 days later, Torres tracked her down in the hallway near the vending machines. She was still in her paramedic uniform from a call, and she had the specific look of someone who had been running on inadequate sleep for longer than was probably sustainable. "Fam told me," Torres said. "The student, he told me what you did in there." Yara kept walking. Torres kept pace with her. He said you called the pneumo before anyone else was even looking at the chest. Fam did good work, Yara said. He's going to be a solid physician if somebody doesn't wring the instinct out of him before he graduates. Where did you train, Army? Torres was quiet for a moment. I was National Guard. Medical. Did one rotation as a 68 whiskey before I went to paramedic school. 68 whiskey was the Army occupational specialty code for combat medic. Torres said it as a kind of offering. Shared language, shared shorthand, and Yara recognized it for what it was. I was an 18 Delta, she said. Torres stopped walking. 18 Delta was Special Forces Medical Sergeant. It was not a common thing to run into in the hallway of a Level 3 hospital in Baxter Falls, Colorado. Jesus, Torres said. And you're pushing a mop cart. I'm pushing a mop cart, Yara said. Does Whitman know? Whitman knows enough. Torres looked at her for a moment. There's a paramedic coordinator position open at Baxter Valley Fire. Friend of mine is on the hiring committee. The pay is, I appreciate it, Yara said. I'm good where I am. It wasn't entirely true. It wasn't entirely false either. She was good where she was in the way that a person who has been running very fast for a very long time is good when they are finally standing still. Not comfortable, exactly. Not pain-free, but stationary, which was something. Which was a start. If you change your mind, Tora said. I'll find you, Yara. The physical therapist's name was Granger, and he was on the 3rd floor, and Yara had been quietly noticing him for the better part of a month without letting herself do anything about it, mostly because she had enough going on internally without adding anything else to the mix. Granger was the one who brought it up. She was in the elevator, the regular one, not the service elevator, because it was almost 7 and the building was thinning out. And he got in on the 2nd floor with a stack of patient files and the tired end of day bearing of a man who had been on his feet since morning. You're the one, he said. From Tuesday. I'm the one from Tuesday. The environmental services person who called the tension pneumo news travels. He looked at her. Not with the recalibration Whitman had done, something more straightforward. My brother was a flight medic, he said. 2 tours in Iraq. He used to do that thing you did. Just know. Walk into a room and know before anyone said anything what the situation was. He said it was pattern recognition. Said it got into your bones. Yara looked at the elevator doors. He's all right, Granger added. My brother, he's good. He owns a hardware store in Nebraska. He said it like it mattered to him, that the story ended that way. Like he'd been carrying the version where it didn't end that way for long enough, that he wanted to say out loud that it had. That's good, Yara said, and meant it. The elevator opened on the 3rd floor. Granger got out, then turned back. For what it's worth, he said. I don't think the mop cart is really you. You don't know me, she said, but she said it without edge, and he seemed to understand the distinction. Fair enough, he said, and the doors closed. The thing about walking away from what you were built to do is that it works, mostly. It works in the daylight, in the routine, in the particular comfort of small ordinary tasks that ask nothing of you. It works when nothing is happening, when the overhead pages are about dietary needs and housekeeping requests and routine labs. It stops working when a child screams in a parking bay or when a monitor alarm has a specific quality that you recognize, or when a young student's hands are shaking over a vein that you could find in your sleep. Yara had known, somewhere beneath the deal she'd made with herself in that Tucson parking lot, that it would stop working eventually. She had known it the way she knew that mornings came after nights, or that altitude affected respiratory rate, or that the things you tried to put down were not the same as the things you'd actually put down. Knowing something and being ready for it were different operations. She was sitting in the break room at the end of her Thursday shift, 9 days after the accident on Highway 24, when Okonkwo came in. Okonkwo was still in her scrubs. She had a cup of coffee and the look of someone who had been turning something over for a while. HR called me, she said, about the incident report from Tuesday. Yara waited. Nobody filed a complaint, Okonkwo said. That's not why they called. They called because Whitman told them what you did, and because 2 of the paramedics told the medical director, and because Pham apparently wrote a 1-page summary for his preceptor. She paused. They want to talk to you about your licensure status. I don't have a licensure status. I separated from service. My certifications have. They want to know if you'd be interested in reinstating, Okonkwo said. There are pathways for veterans, for people with documented field hours. She set her coffee cup down on the table. There's also a clinical coordinator position opening up in January. Emergency services. It would be a significant shift from your current role. Yara was quiet. I'm not telling you what to do, Okonkwo said. I'm telling you what the options are. Because you came through my trauma bay and you saw what nobody else was seeing, and that's not nothing. That's not a thing that should be pushing a cart down a hallway. Yara looked at the table, at the ring left by someone else's coffee cup, at the small circular evidence of all the ordinary mornings that had happened in this room before this one. I've been hiding, she said. It was the first time she had said it out loud to anyone. I know, Okonkwo said. You're allowed to. You've probably earned a certain amount of hiding. She picked up her coffee. But Tuesday happened. And the man in Bay 1 is alive. And I think you already know what that means for whatever arrangement you made with yourself about staying out of it. She left. Yara sat there for a while. The overhead page ran through its sequence. Dietary, housekeeping, a routine call for labs, and she listened to it the way she'd been listening to it for 8 months. The familiar landscape of small, manageable things. The world running at its ordinary register. She thought about the 47 minutes in the back of that vehicle. She thought about Trevino's name, which she could always say. She thought about a 9-year-old girl named Poppy, holding a fast food napkin to her arm and watching how adults behaved. She thought about Pham writing grid coordinates on his hand. She thought about her brother Granger had said, "He's good. He owns a hardware store in Nebraska." She thought about the difference between hiding and healing, and how for a long time she had convinced herself they were the same thing. They were not the same thing. She had always known they were not the same thing. She got up, put her cup in the sink, picked up her jacket from the back of the chair. On her way out, she stopped at the nursing station and asked Okonkwo for the number for HR. She did not feel ready. She suspected she would not feel ready when she made the call, or when she went through whatever process came after. She suspected that readiness, like a lot of things she had once believed were prerequisites, was something that arrived after you started moving rather than before. She had learned that in a vehicle, in the dark, on a road that wasn't a road with 47 minutes on the clock and someone else's life in her hands, she had known it ever since.